Welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail, and we are those people. I'm Mike Bowden-Distel, head of Intermodal Solutions here at FreightWaves, and I'm joined, as always, by Joanna Marsh, our editorial writer who follows the railroad industry. And today we're going to be speaking with Chuck Baker. He's the president of American Shortline and Regional Railroad Associations. And before we do that, Joanna, I would like to go through one of your articles that you just put on really one of the top, maybe the topic of the hour right now is the carload traffic growth at Vancouver, believe it or not, is growing on the grain side, sort of in spite of the strike or maybe because of the strike.
Yeah. So even though, international intermodal has taken a hit, because because there's a federal mandate in Canada, that grain shipments continue. Grain is actually still moving through the port of Vancouver, and actually at Prince Rupert, I believe it's what's it now? Petroleum and coal is actually moving at a pretty good clip because the terminal where those commodities move isn't affected by the contract negotiations. That said, I'm not sure if you caught it. There was actually just kind of late breaking news, like within the last hour, that there has been an agreement reached between the dock workers union and the port operators, and so that still of course has to be ratified, but it is a 4-year agreement, so we'll see how it goes. And I believe the port operators are saying they're hopeful, of course, that that things can go back to normal should the agreement be ratified. So that's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, that would be a big relief for the Canadian railroads in particular.
Yeah.
I think the sooner that gets resolved, the sooner they can get their networks back to normal, which even the short period of time, and that was almost 2 weeks, is going to be hugely disruptive. So that's a little bit of an update. So that's a little bit of an update. I think we should save most of the time here for today's guest. I want to bring in Chuck Baker. Chuck Baker is president of the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Associations. Chuck, are you there?
I sure am.
It's great to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Long-time listener, first-time participant, I guess. But I think you guys do a great job. I'm a loyal Joanna Marsh reader, and so I'm happy to be on the podcast.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you.
Great, nice of you to say that.
Yeah, Chuck, if you don't mind moving a little bit, I think it's just there you go. Oh, yeah, there you go. Okay, that's perfect. It's great to have you.
Joanna.
Yeah, it's a mirrored display on my computer. So if I move right, it shows me moving left. So I have to reorient my brain.
Yeah, it is pretty
Gotcha. Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar with shortline railroads, maybe just know the class ones. I mean, can you give us a little bit of an update or just a little bit of an overview of what's a shortline or regional railroad, and what does your association do for those organizations?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So we're the National Trade Association. Just like pretty much every industry you could possibly fathom has a National Trade Association somewhere in Washington, D.C. We're the association for shortline railroads. Most people who are familiar with freight railroads certainly could name probably all 6 of the big Class 1 railroads, but very few people know there are actually another 600 shortline railroads in the country. Those are technically, they're called Class 2 or 3 railroads, but we colloquially refer to them as shortline railroads. And they're essentially the first mile and last mile of the freight railroad network. Another way to think of them is many of them, sort of the typical short line, is basically what used to be kind of an unloved, unsuccessful, not priority kind of branch line of a bigger railroad. And over time, those got spun off and turned into independent short line railroads, where the short line can kind of focus on that one, 30 or 50 or 70 mile section of track and really focus on serving just those customers and trying to grow a few more customers, providing great service to those customers, and then, taking that traffic and handing it to a Class 1. And by and large, it's been a pretty great success stories. So there's 600 of them throughout the country, and in total, it's about 50,000 miles of track.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of railroads. So really, they're in many ways tied to the class ones, sort of as first mile and last mile. At the same time, they're really kind of in a different business altogether. And you need an organization like yours to work in their best interest. And what are some of the specific issues and sort of regulatory concerns that the short lines are interested in?
Yeah, that's right. For trade associations, we do lots of stuff, right? Like we do conferences and we do weekly newsletters and we do safety templates. But you're right to ask about kind of the regulatory and legislative issues. That's our primary purpose for existing. We help the short lines in DC, and so we spend a lot of time talking about legislation and regulation. Railroading is it's a highly regulated industry. It has been for a long time. We are very dependent, both good and bad, on what's going on a national policy level. And so we play offense and defense, right? On the offense side, which is always a little bit more fun, we try to help railroads get money, to help short lines get money to invest in infrastructure, right? Our class one friends are big, profitable companies. They don't need federal help for investing in infrastructure, and they don't ask for it. Short lines are very different, right? Like we talked about, we're there to preserve lines in smaller areas. And so we do need help, and we ask for it, and we've been pretty successful at getting it. So there's something called 45G, which is a short line railroad tax credit, which we've worked on for a long time, and it's now a part of the federal tax code that helps. And on an annual basis, at this point, we're very focused on the CRISI grant program, which can provide, this year is providing north of $1 billion in opportunity for short lines to go after. Short lines won't get it all because there's also passenger rail going after it, and even communities going after it for kind of grade crossings and grade separations and some class one projects. But short lines are directly eligible, and we'll spend a lot of time working on that program and trying to go for it. So that's kind of on the fun offense side. And then we spend time playing defense too, whether it's rail safety legislation. And sometimes I'll put safety in air quotes there, because there's things that sometimes people say is rail safety that we say is not rail safety. Crew size perhaps being, the signature one of those issues. Also, truck size and weight is a big issue that we play, I guess you'd call it defense on. We think that large trucks already don't pay their fair share of their infrastructure damage, and the idea of increasing the size or the weight of those trucks is a bad idea for infrastructure and safety, but is obviously also a big threat to railroads. And so those are some of the highlights and the lowlights right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think in some of the some of the bills that come to pass, they kind of group all railroads together, kind of treat all railroads the same. I mean, you mentioned the thing like the crew size. Well, I mean, it's so different on a short line where it's not going as fast. Maybe you're not going through a community that maybe no person crew or one person crew is just fine.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are hundreds. I mean, literally hundreds of short lines that today are operating trains with only one person in the cab. Mm-hmm. And they've been doing it that way for many years, decades in many cases. Many of those have a second person kind of trailing the train in essentially like a pickup truck or a utility truck. And that person can drive ahead and line switches and check on crossings. They can observe the train as it goes by. They can get to a customer yard and get things prepped. But we've been doing it that way for decades, safely and with no problem. And, and I would probably argue that class ones also could do that, on a practical basis. On a contract basis, they can't do that because of their labor union negotiations. But the idea that Congress would need to regulate crew size doesn't really fit with our experience, or the FRA needing to proactively do it also doesn't fit. And I would agree with your sort of hypothesis there, Michael, that, with smaller companies moving slower trains, often not in any kind of high threat urban area, the argument for additional crew members kind of even more specious. But you just don't need a second person in the cab to operate a short line train.
Yeah. And I guess if you don't mind, I know that I believe that ASLRA and the Association of American Railroads are involved in have filed a lawsuit with California regulators regarding the zero emissions locomotives mandate that they have. Could you explain sort of like your interest in it and what you hope to see happen? As the issue progresses?
Yeah, it's frankly an unfortunate situation. I don't wake up looking to sue states or state regulatory agencies. That's not kind of how we prefer to spend our time. Just to go on a slight tangent, I'm in this industry, like I chose this job in this field because I really feel like railroads are the good guys, and particularly short line railroads. I think it's good for the economy, good for the environment, good for public safety to move more freight by rail. And so when we see regulatory agencies kind of overdo it and do stuff that we think can harm our ability to move freight by rail, it's very upsetting and sort of causes a lot of like cognitive dissonance over here. But the CARB has proposed a regulation that is just wildly impractical on any sort of reasonable time frame, or in the world where like there are finite dollars and the money doesn't grow on trees. They have proposed a rule that before you even talk about zero emissions, one of the things in this rule says by 2030, no railroad operating in California shall have any locomotive that is older than 23 years old. And I know that we can't hear our audience, but if there are people listening who understand short lines, they are now like either gasping or laughing out loud, right? Like there are many short lines that literally only have locomotives that are older than 23 years old. So the idea of just saying you can't have a locomotive older than 23 years old just does not at all fit with the realities of being a short line railroad and how we're trying to preserve these kind of marginal lines and run freight, inexpensively and efficiently and with a kind of a small budget sometimes. California wants to get to zero emissions, and we are obviously very pro-environment. Moving freight by rail is the most environmentally friendly way to move freight. And we are very interested in getting better than we are right now. So we're doing lots of stuff, right? Pilot programs, testing out electric locomotives, hydrogen locomotives, testing out fuel additives, doing rail grinding, rail lubrication. Obviously, like as we get money, we upgrade locomotives and put them in newer tier classes. But mandating zero emission locomotives anytime soon is just not, the technology is not there yet. It's certainly not at scale, and it's certainly not affordable for short lines. They tend to buy like 30-year-old kind of hand-me-down locomotives for $100,000, and the idea of spending $5 or $6 million on a brand new tier 5 that doesn't exist, zero emission locomotive, is just not, that's just not something that fits with reality.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That doesn't make a lot of sense to mandate those things. Maybe I just want to shift gears and can you talk a little bit about rail service? I know a lot of the shippers have really complained about rail service the past, really since the pandemic, and blamed a lot of that on not having the crew sizes. How has that impacted the short line community?
Yeah, it's a great question. So short lines are railroads, of course, right? And if you go out and look, they look like railroads. And if you talk to them, they can speak railroad, but they also many of them really think of themselves and kind of act more like a shipper representative on a daily basis, right? Like they've got maybe the first 30 miles, right? And so they deal with the customer and they go switch the customer and they get the stuff and they move it 30 miles across their line, and then they hand it to a class one where it needs to go the next 1,200 miles to its final destination. So when there are problems on the class one network, it affects short lines very much in the same way it would affect shippers. And, it is definitely not any sort of like breaking news or even controversial statement at this point to say that the last few years have not been the best time for railroad service. I think, frankly, the industry is kind of embarrassed about the service that we provided holistically over 2021 and 2022, and there's a lot of causes for that, whether it's kind of overcooking PSR and too many layoffs in 18 and 19, or whether it's furloughs during COVID in 2020 and then crews not coming back and a historically tight labor market, or there's a sort of a lengthy list of reasons and boogeymen to talk about. The reality is that service wasn't up to par over the last couple of years, and it's been a big problem. I think it's cost a lot of short lines volume opportunities. It's caused huge frustrations. It's cost shippers money. It's cost short lines money, and it's probably cost class ones money too. And I think, and I don't want to step on what would hopefully be your next question, but the good news is I do think it is starting to get better. I think we are really starting to see some green shoots out there on actual improving service, improving metrics, maybe led most of all by CSX, which has really started to see a pretty dramatic turn. But I think we're going to see it all kind of industry-wide starting to really get better pretty soon, and already starting to happen. And then I also think, and this is maybe more important to me than to somebody who's actually like shipping stuff tomorrow, but we're also hearing, I think, really good kind of getting it messages from the CEOs of the big class ones, particularly Joe at CSX, Alan at NS, Tracy at CN, and Keith at CP are all really have pretty dramatically changed the focus of the message, away from OR and towards service, growth, partnership, good relationships with employees, hiring, not furloughing next time there's a downturn, and really saying kind of like, we as an industry need to be here for shippers over a cycle and prove that it's not going to be like good service for 2 years and bad service for 2 years and good and bad and boom and bust, and just say like, we're your forever partner, right? Like you can invest, you can trust us, and we will get this right. And so I want to believe, the short lines want to believe, and I think I'm feeling good about it, and hopefully I'm not being, naive about it.
Yeah, we'll see when there's a full, business cycle and when volumes really dip, if they actually, stick to that and don't furlough. And we'll see how investors react to that. Are they too short-sighted? Can they take that longer-term approach? Because all those things are in the longer-term best interest of the industry. It's just not all the investors to have a long-term time horizon.
Sure.
Speaking of investors, one of the companies I used to cover was Genesee, Wyoming, big short line holding company. A lot of the short lines are owned by a big holding company like that, or Watco. What are the advantages of having that ownership structure for a short line, and what are some drawbacks?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. So there's let's say 600 short line railroads. G&W owns about 100 of them. Watco owns about 40 of them. Omnitrax has about 20. Patriot Rail's got about 30 now that they merged with Pioneer. RJ Corman's got about 20. And then there's a few more that's got, Regional Rail and Florida Gulf and Atlantic that have, 5 or 10. So there's probably north of 300, maybe 350 short lines at this point that are owned by some size holding company, and then another couple hundred that are, purely sort of independent. I would say the good news from my point of view, and I think from the shipper point of view, and blessedly so far from the regulator point of view too, is that there's really not that much of a difference. On the ground, a short line owned and operated by G&W really doesn't act or look particularly meaningfully different than like a pure independent. I think they provide the same type of service, the same type of kind of like bend over backwards, do everything the customer asks, because you only have a few customers, so you got to keep them real happy. They have the same opportunities and challenges with their class one interchange partners and all that stuff. There are some kind of obvious advantages, just like maybe like a business school 101 type stuff, right? Like if you own 100 different short lines, you don't have to have 100 different web guys to like get your website right. Like you can have a couple of web guys and they can get the internet part right for everything. And if you're going to be buying ties for 20 different short lines, you don't need 20 different purchasing or procurement managers, right? Like you can have one and they can buy things in bulk, right? And you don't need 20 different CFOs, and you don't need 20 different tax guys, and you don't need 20 different lawyers. And so there are some things that make sense to centralize, and I think that helps with the cost structure and probably the sophistication and reporting tools and stuff like that. But there's still hundreds of pure independents out there. And they have their own advantages, right? Like if you're truly a pure independent and it's still the same family that's owned the railroad for 50 years, that maybe really accentuates like what everybody loves about short line, right? Like the owner is the president, and he can also operate the train on Tuesday, and he's also friends with all the local congressmen, and he's also a member of the local chamber of commerce, and he sponsors the local little league team and all that stuff too. So they're kind of different vibes of different short lines, but more so there's more similarities than differences, blessedly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, I guess in the sort of about like 2 minutes we have left, kind of thinking about technological advancements, such as Rail Pulse and other sort of tools to promote supply chain visibility. Is that having any significant impact on the short line railroads? The technologies that are happening with the class ones, or how much of those advancements do you see? I won't say trickle down, but or maybe I don't know if short lines themselves are kind of actively involved in getting some of those tech advancements going.
Yeah, I mean, Rail Pulse as an association, I'm not technically involved in Rail Pulse, but I've sort of appointed myself as one of their head cheerleaders. I think it's a fantastic program, and I think it's going to be a huge deal for the industry. Not today, right? It's going to take a couple of years to get at scale where they can put these sensors with GPS and door open or closed and impact and wheel temperature and all that stuff. It'll take a few years to get those on to thousands and tens of thousands and hopefully eventually, 1 million plus rail cars. But I think once that's out there and everybody can see where their car is and the status of those cars at any time on any railroad, I think that'll be a really seminal moment in our industry. Frankly, it's maybe a little embarrassing that we're just kind of getting into this conversation in a very serious way in 2023, because, we probably we're behind on this, but better late than never. And I think for short lines, that sort of visibility and ability to give transparency to the customers and comfort to them that they can see their stuff and we know where it is going to help sell moving freight by rail, which is what we're most excited to do. There are plenty of other kind of technologies out there besides Rail Pulse that people are involved in day to day with, EDIs and APIs and readers and stuff like that. But that's probably the topic of a whole separate podcast.
Yeah, really a lot going on there in terms of technological advancements. Things like just automated repair, detecting which cars need to be repaired, which track needs to be repaired, all of those things. But you've really done a lot with safety. Saw that you gave out a number of safety awards recently for having 0 injuries, which is really impressive. So sort of commend you on that. We're about out of time, but where can people go reach out to you or the Short Line Association?
Yeah, I appreciate that. We're on the internet, of course, aslrra.org. But if you really want to get to know short lines, the best place would be come to one of our events, and they're also on the website. But we have 2 regional meetings in the fall: September in Long Beach, November in Lexington, and then our big one is every spring. So March 2024 will be in Kansas City, and we'll have a good 1,800 people there. It is a really fun 2.5 days, and it's like a deep dive into everything short line you could ever want. So come on out.
Sounds like a great event. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for being on.
Thank you. Appreciate it.